Hi, everyone. I'm Madhav Rajan. I'm the Dean and the George Schultz Professor of Accounting at Chicago Booth. Thank you all for taking time to be with us today for what will be our last Distinguished Speaker Series event for the year. And we're ending on a really, really high note as we welcome Booth alum John Winkelried from TPG and Marianne Hancock of Y Analytics to our Distinguished Speaker Series. This is a long-standing Chicago tradition, of course, and the goal is to bring high-profile leaders from the business, from the government, from the community to the school to share their insights and experience. So the virtual DSS, as you know, we launched last April when the pandemic hit. We had a bunch of alums come and talk about their companies and their experience with the pandemic, including Kurt Del Bene from Microsoft, Tom Ricketts of the Cubs, Jenny Scanlon from UL, and many others. And the events were so successful, we sort of continued them through the summer and then through the year. And we've had conversations with people like Anne Mukherjee from Pernod Ricard, JP Gann, Dave McLennan of Cargill, and many others. Recently, we had Julia Golden from the Lego Group, Michael Armstrong from Viacom CBS about 10 days ago. I'm really thrilled to introduce today's speakers. I'll start with John. John Winkelried is co-chief executive officer and a partner of TPG. He was formerly with Goldman Sachs for more than 27 years and stepped down in 2009 as president and co-chief operating officer. So he was a partner at Goldman from 1990 onwards and longstanding member of the firm's management committee, the partnership committee, capital committee, and also founding chairman of the business practices committee. He also served on the board of directors for the Goldman Sachs Group. John holds a BA in economics from UChicago and his MBA from Chicago Booth. We're also thrilled to welcome Marianne Hancock, who's Chief Executive Officer of Y Analytics, which is TPG's impact assessment platform, and ESG, also manages their ESG performance capability. And so in that role, she leads a unique team that basically thinks about how to deliver impact by TPG's RISE funds and create new impact investing platforms. And before this, Marianne spent 20 years at McKinsey, where she was a senior partner. Marianne co-founded McKinsey's K through 12 education practice in the US, served on several poverty alleviation nonprofits, including CARE. She holds a BA with honors and an MA in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia and a JD magna cum laude from Harvard Law School. Thank you very much, John and Marianne, for being with us today.
Well, pleasure to be here.
Great to be here.
So, thank you. And so, John, maybe I'll start with you. You left Goldman Sachs after a long career, moved to TPG. What was sort of the motivation behind the move, and what's kept you at TPG?
Well, I think, I spent, as you pointed out, I went immediately from Chicago, where I think you can figure out from the dates I was on the, excuse me, sorry. I was on the 5-year program there, and I went immediately from U of C to Wall Street to Goldman, and after 27 years, I really kind of spent my entire adult life there, right? I mean, from school right to Goldman, and then held a number of different positions and responsibilities, and had a fabulous career and a fabulous experience at Goldman Sachs for 27 years. And I got to a point where I was really thinking, maybe there's something else for me to do, after all that experience. And so my first move, Madhav, was really not right away, not immediately to TPG. My first move was really to think through how I could do some investing on my own. And I was really thinking in terms of really kind of structuring and starting a family office type concept. And so my break between Goldman and TPG was really about 5 years. And that was a valuable 5 years for me, because I it allowed me to frankly decompress a little bit from Goldman Sachs, which was a intense 27-year run. And it also allowed me to think through what I wanted to do next, and what I was interested in, frankly. And you do need a little bit of space in order to sort that out. And so that was an important experience. I I made some new relationships and started to focus on some things that I really hadn't focused on. As an example, I got very involved in some early stage venture investing, which actually, I've continued to stay interested in, to this day. But so 5 years in, for a combination of reasons, I got contacted by TPG, and TPG it was something I wasn't really looking for. But what was interesting to me was TPG was at a very interesting point in its trajectory and growth. They were looking for some additional leadership capabilities and skills that a lot of which I had developed by running a bunch of businesses at Goldman. And for me, it was also an opportunity. I wasn't really necessarily at that point in my life interested in going back into sort of the New York experience. TPG is headquartered in San Francisco. And, I had not lived in San Francisco. San Francisco is a very different environment. The inputs and the stimulus that you're kind of surrounded by is very different. It's really frankly, it's really sort of a technology dominated place, as everybody knows, because of what's happened in the Valley and in San Francisco generally, the Bay Area generally. And so, combination of being intrigued by the platform and what I could bring to it, feeling like it would continue to help focus me in the investing activity that I was more interested in at this point. And then thirdly, changing my surroundings with different inputs, which I had only done one other time, which was when I had moved to London for a few years. And it was a very broadening experience. And so, my wife and I discussed it, and, we decided, look, at the time I was 55. I felt like, I had another good sort of push left in me, and it was an intriguing opportunity. And so we decided to do it. So we moved to the West Coast, and we've been there ever since. And 5.5 years in, and it's been a very enjoyable and successful experience so far.
Mhm. So one question that came from the audience they submitted in advance was the transition from banker to investor. Sort of how different are the roles? How much was that a transition for you?
Yeah. Well, there is a different mindset to it. And, at Goldman, I had the luxury of having multiple roles, from spending time in banking to then running one of the largest trading divisions of the firm. I ran the fixed income, currency, and commodities division for a while. Then when I ended up in the executive office, I had responsibility for the merchant banking activities of the firm. So I had a taste of the kind of the discipline and the sort of kind of daily life cycle of kind of how you need to kind of shape your thinking as an investor prior to getting to TPG. But the question is still a relevant question, because I think that there is a different discipline to being an investor from a banker. Bankers, one characteristic I would say is that bankers really are in business to sort of make transactions happen. And I know that's a gross generalization, but you're there sort of trying to facilitate and make transactions happen. You're hopefully trying to make good transactions happen, but that's what your focus and mission is. When you're an investor, you're trying to figure out which transactions should happen. And so it's a bit of a different filter and a bit of a different lens. And the culture of the firm, the overriding culture of the firm, and the things you emphasize in terms of kind of leading a firm like TPG versus Goldman Sachs are also different. I would say by definition in an investing universe, an investing world, the culture is by definition much flatter in a sense than perhaps sort of the structural dynamics of a place like Goldman Sachs. So there are important differences, and in any change like the one that I experienced, you have to give yourself time to kind of transition into a role and grow into a new role. And it's, as long as you're sort of willing and you're really interested in that, I think it's pretty easy to do. But you do have to recognize that day one, when you get there, you still have a lot to learn. And so you have to kind of absorb the nature of the culture, and you have to modify sort of the things that are your priorities in terms of what you're doing day to day.
You speak about just being a leader during the pandemic. How has that been for you? And where do you see sort of the world going as it looks like we're coming out of this?
Yeah. Well, I think in the investing world more generally, and I've talked to a lot of colleagues and a lot of friends that are in the investing world, I think it was a pretty remarkable experience, the pandemic. Obviously the whole year has been a pretty remarkable year when you consider what's happened over the course of, from really February and March of 2020 to where we are today, both in terms of, the business environment, the investing environment, the social environment. I mean, it's pretty remarkable actually what's happened. And so there's been this massive kind of evolution of a lot of sort of our priors in terms of, what we consider to be normal and how we adapt to it. I think that the biggest surprise, I think, in managing through the pandemic is obviously technology gave us the ability to kind of almost instantaneously snap ourselves from being kind of an in-office culture to a Zoom culture to, doing things this way. There are certain benefits and detriments of this, but I think people have adapted extremely well to it, and productivity has remained very high. I think I don't think anyone would have predicted that, 2020 from a value creation year and from an investing results year would have been one of the best years ever. Sitting there in March and watching what was happening to the markets, the volatility, businesses shutting down, some businesses going to zero revenue, obviously some businesses experiencing a COVID bump or acceleration. So I think everyone was adapting very much real time. The leadership role in that context is helping people adapt and making sure people are staying focused on what matters. And then also from an organizational perspective, supporting people, because people were under quite a bit of stress. You have everything from, people that our youngest people who might have been living, among 3 or 4 people and all trying to do Zoom at the same time. And so, stress relating to that. You had some isolation issues with people. You had families where kids all of a sudden were home. So, I mean, it was full on for a while in terms of trying to make sure that besides minding the store from a business perspective, we were also minding the store from a kind of a cultural and people perspective. And so we had a great team. I mean, we just had a great team, and our team kind of navigated through it, extremely ably. And, TPG has come through it stronger as a result of all that. We are now at that moment of beginning to think about how we transition back to something. And, so we're working on that.
Just on that, John, if you think about, in the beginning, there were announcements of, we're going to be remote all the time, by some companies, and they seem to be kind of pulling back. Do you ever see going remote all the time, or what would be some of the cost to that?
No, I don't. I mean, I think, there are obviously different business models, I think, will accommodate different kinds of behavior, but, we're in a apprentice style business. That's how people learn. Young people, are part of deal teams, investing teams. And there's just a lot of value kind of being together enough. So there's value to that. There's value to kind of senior people walking the halls, as I call it, and basically, and that's something I learned early on in my career, that senior people need to make themselves visible. They need to make themselves available. Like, one of the things that I believe strongly in is that leaders of organizations like this need to be accessible. And it's a little harder to be accessible this way. It's not impossible, because, people want to get on my schedule, or other of our leaders' schedules. They get on it. We have a Zoom call, or we have a, but, when you're in the office physically, people can walk by, stick their head in the office, et cetera. I can walk around. We come together at an investment committee or at other meetings of the firm. So I think there's a lot of value in that. There's a lot of value in the cultural kind of connectivity that it creates. And there's kind of a nice natural pace to that. Now, given the fact that there are things that have changed and will probably continue to linger in terms of kind of the COVID effect, I do think we have to be more flexible. And we are putting ourselves in a position to try to be more flexible with respect to certain people's situations. So we've had people that had to temporarily relocate. We need to be more flexible. We've had people that we also have a dynamic now where certain people are vaccinated, certain people are not. So we're dealing with that issue in terms of, as people come back to the office, are we doing vaccinated folks first? We are. And then we have to provide more flexibility for those people that aren't vaccinated. We're very aware of and tolerant of the fact that not everybody wants to be vaccinated. So we also have to make allowances for that. So I think that we will be finding kind of a new balance as we come through this. But I don't think that we're, being this way forever is not what we're about.
Mhm. Thank you. Before I bring in Marianne, I wanted to maybe ask you to sort of set up what is the RISE Fund? What was sort of the rationale behind its creation, and what does it try to do?
Yes. Well, I think we, about, 4 to 5 years ago, we began a process of thinking through this dynamic of what is impact investing. We felt like we were at a place as a firm where not only from frankly, an investment opportunity perspective, as the world was getting sort of more focused on and more aware of things like ESG related initiatives, companies that were really mission-based companies, we felt like there was something happening in the market with respect to capital flowing to these types of opportunities. But there really hadn't been in the private markets, there really hadn't been what I would call sort of an institutionally scaled effort. And I guess sort of what we think of as non-impact investing. And by the way, that's an interesting subject today in terms of, how the kind of the convergence between sort of investing generally and sort of value-based investing in terms of what you're trying to accomplish or what you're willing to invest in. But as we thought about that, there was a large institutionally sized and created world that's scaled massively in terms of private capital investing, whether it's buyouts, growth, venture, real estate, infrastructure, et cetera, credit. And but in this particular part of the market, I would say that there were sort of niche strategies that existed, and many of them had this notion that you had to sort of, if you wanted to invest for impact, you also had to settle for concessionary returns. We had a different view and a different philosophy that in order for these companies that were creating real positive impact along a number of different pathways, which Marianne will talk about in a few minutes, that we really, for it to be sustainable, okay, it has to generate, and it will generate, superior returns. And the longer we've been doing this, the more convinced of that we are, because concessionary capital doesn't attract the amount of capital necessary to really drive change and drive innovation. So we basically, our thesis, we'd set up a pool of capital that was similarly sized, as an example, to kind of a growth equity fund type size. So we raised $2 billion for our first fund. And the concept was we'd have a dual underwriting standard, that we would require private equity style, growth equity style returns, but we would also establish a measurement vehicle to hold ourselves accountable with respect to impact. And I'll let Marianne go into that because I don't want to steal her thunder on that, because that became a very important part of an underpinning, that we would invest enough in a robust measurement structure so that investors could really understand what we were doing. And I will say, and I think Marianne would probably admit that it's, none of these things ever are perfection, but in terms of creating rigor around, a measurement philosophy and a measurement methodology, I think that we've done a pretty good job, and relative to the rest of the industry, something that really didn't exist in this way before. So that's where we started. And since that time, we have invested our first fund. We've raised the second RISE fund, which is about $2.2 billion of capital. We have a really interesting portfolio of companies that are performing quite well as part of the first fund and now as part of the second fund. And then our next move in the RISE impact world was recognizing what was going on and how much energy and focus has been placed on climate and climate change. The world's moving very rapidly to try to mobilize technology, innovation, science, and business fundamentals to deal with the challenge of climate change, we decided to raise an additional pool of capital that focuses explicitly on backing interesting technologies as it relates to climate change. And so we're now in the process of raising TPG Rise Climate. And we roped in my former boss from Goldman Sachs, Hank Paulson, as the executive chairman of that fund. And so he and Jim Coulter, my partner, and Marianne are really among the leadership team that are really establishing that strategy. So let me stop there.
Okay, fantastic. So Marianne, maybe you could say, tell us, how does Y Analytics work? How does it shape TPG's decision-making about where to invest?
Sure. Well, first, let me just say, as a non-Chicago, it's a real privilege to be in this conversation. We have found so many kindred spirits in Chicago in terms of the work we do at Y Analytics, and every one of those interactions has been a gift. So it's great to be in conversation on this. The core mission, as John started to lay out there for Y Analytics, is to bring research and capital together for good. And by that, I mean that we work at our heart with the Rise platform funds who are promising both financial returns and impact returns to translate just a vast wealth of medical, scientific, social, economic, educational research, all the research that is out there about effectiveness of different solutions, to translate that into a financial decision. And the way we think about that is as an impact return on investment. And we work with the funds during due diligence and then all the way through hold to come up with that estimated impact return on investment and to make sure that that's grounded in evidence. As John said, it's never perfect, but to really think critically about what are the drivers of impact, what's the magnitude of impact, and what's that return, and then to track that over time. So most folks in this community would probably recognize it in some form or fashion as good old-fashioned cost-benefit analysis, but in the context not of applied towards policy, but really for the first time applied into investment decisions.
Mm-hmm. So this is, of course, a new discipline in terms of measuring. I mean, we've all measured financial impact. Measuring mm-hmm. social impact is newer, one would say exponentially harder. How did you go about developing a methodology to sort of tackle that?
Sure. Well, as I said, there has been such really thorough work done in other domains, particularly in policy domains. Mm-hmm. There's also this tremendous wealth of research that we can leverage about the effectiveness of different kinds of social solutions, mm-hmm. Whether that's in, again, sort of health interventions or education interventions or financial inclusion interventions. And then we leverage our own expertise in thinking about finance and really created a model that looks at the outputs of the company, the products and services, and then thinks about the outcomes based on evidence and research that those outputs are going to drive, puts a value on those relative to what research can tell us is actually real, and then adjusts for risk. So we've now done this. The privilege of getting to do this work with TPG at scale is the fact that we've done it across the now $5 billion worth of assets under management, assessed over 400 companies, and we're constantly learning because the research itself is advancing, because we get to see and apply this at the coalface on the front lines every day. We learn things that need to be improved in methodology and try to share that as much as possible.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned cost benefit, and in your mind, do you feel you have the ability to say veto certain investments, or you would say just lay out the information and it's up to somebody else to make that decision as to do a go or no go on it?
Well, this is really one of the brilliant factors in terms of how TPG set up the Rise Fund as a platform. So it sits on the chassis of the rest of TPG, which is really important from an ability to be a global scaled fund and to source, but it's also really healthy from an impact perspective. Because if a deal doesn't meet the test of both financial and impact assessment, it still can be done somewhere else, right? It still can be done in another part of TPG. Mm-hmm. That is a little bit different from how some other impact funds have gone about establishing themselves. And so that allows for a healthy dynamic where you're really trying to understand the likely impact, the risks, the sensitivities, just like you would on the financial side. Mm-hmm. So it's a pretty healthy discussion at that level.
Mm-hmm. So the next set of questions, I'm going to open it up to both of you, however you want to do it. And the question is, when you think about positive social impact and profitability, as John said, in your view, they both have to be provided. I mean, do you always see that? How do you think about the trade-off? Because historically, the notion has been, oh, you're constraining the set, and therefore, the financial returns are going to be lower. Sort of, do you feel like you have sort of proof of concept now that that's really not the case, that you can actually do well and do good, if you will?
Sure. So I'm happy to start, John, and then feel free to pile on. The unlock concept is one that we call collinearity, which means that market rate of return and impact is not necessarily appropriate for every social ill that we have in the world. But for some, it works really well. And it works when you have a company whose product and service is what delivers the impact, so that in a collinear way, the more you sell of the product and service, the better the financials, the better the impact. Now, that's not always 100% true. You can have pricing issues or leverage, right? But the Rise funds seek to find companies like that. So an education technology company like Dreambox Learning, where the product is what delivers the math increases, or a healthcare delivery company where it's the patient delivery that is delivering the impact. And that's a really core concept, because there are lots of problems in our world that don't lend themselves to that, or there are business models that are also healthy, important business models that are key for philanthropic funding or governmental type of support. But this is the key niche that we sit in, and is really about how you scale those together.
I guess the only thing I would add to that, Madhav, is that I think that this collinearity issue and the rigor associated with not sacrificing one or the other is very important to our investor base. I think our investor base that has come along with us on this, and as you might imagine, it is some of the most important public pension funds of the world, sovereign wealth funds, some family offices, some endowments. So it's pretty much of a, you would look at it and say this is kind of a who's who within kind of institutional private investing. And I think our investors have really now accepted and believe this collinearity concept and really endorse it and back it. And I think that that's become an important core component of the perpetuation of this strategy and the continued growth of the strategy, and what I think makes it viable longer term. So I think that perspective is important as well.
So if you think about ESG, I mean, the set of ways to measure it, the set of standards, I mean, there's sort of a plethora of them. Do you see them sort of converging? Is that even a good thing that they would converge? Or do you feel like, no, there really doesn't need to be a single one, and there are sort of different standards for different settings? I'd love to get both of your opinions on that.
Go ahead.
Well, we joke in my team that we're not doing our homework well, we're not doing our jobs well if we haven't found another acronym each week. So there is an aspect to that. Sorry, John, did you want to start?
No, you please, you go.
On the ESG side, which I would differentiate from the impact assessment side, when we're talking about the inputs and the way a company drives whatever product and creates whatever product it's going to create, we are a long way from a standard. It's not even clear that in the breadth of what would be encompassed under that umbrella, that you could have one standard, but we are moving in a direction of some consensus. And I think we often say that it took 70 years to get to GAP, and this is on an accelerated time frame. And there are some core aspects of greenhouse gas disclosures and some core aspects of diversity and inclusion, which we can all see our way to relatively. It will be very helpful if, from any kind of disclosure or regulatory perspective, if we don't have multiple regimes all over the world, because the burden will be quite substantial to have different types of standards. But you can certainly see your way there. On the impact side, on the product, that's a different story. And I think it's going to be more bespoke for quite some time, but there's really good work going on in different avenues around that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that given the diversity of opinion about how to think about impact investing, how to bring to life the various sort of components of ESG, I'm not sure we'll ever get to a standard. And I think that I don't know. I think it's frustrating to some of the participants in this market that we don't have a standard, because I think, sort of trying to figure out how do I benchmark this, or how do I. So I think that is somewhat frustrating. I think from a just if I may say from a commercial perspective for a second, I think that in some respects that might be an advantage for us, because we have invested a lot behind this question of how we measure and articulate the impact, and how we hold ourselves accountable for it, not only by doing impact assessment when we first make an investment, but also tracking it over time, which Marianne's team is responsible for. And I think that, so when you think about the world committing capital to this, and you have a bunch of different alternatives, and you think about, well, where am I going to place my, where am I going to make my investments? And where can I then report back to the constituencies that I need to report to? We're providing something that I think is differentiated as it relates to, at least, again, some level of rigor around this standard. So I think that we feel pretty good about the approach that we've taken, but it's not the only approach.
If I may, I would say from a hope perspective, my hope is that we get out of the binary world of saying something is good or bad. And on the impact side, that we start talking about the magnitude of impact and then the return on the investment. On the ESG side, we start talking about improvement, right? Every company out there can make improvements and needs to make improvements to transition to the just world, the climate-oriented world that we need to go to. So instead of this binary world on either dimension, it would be helpful to talk about magnitude and improvement.
So when you think about social impact, are there certain types of social impact you're simply unable to measure at this point that, just give us some examples of what has sort of frustrated you about not being able to measure certain things?
Well, we are, as I mentioned, really grounded in the research, the third-party research that exists. And so increasingly, there are fields that are really taking creative ways to study and understand effect sizes, but there are fields, by the way, that don't also have business models that also lend themselves to collinear types of profitable investment either. So they tend to have a pretty high overlap in Venn diagram. So interventions that would increase rule of law or democracy, pretty challenging to measure, not inconceivable to measure, but pretty challenging to measure, but also less likely to have a business model that is going to fit the dual premise. So we are constantly amazed and impressed by the amount of research that does exist that we can under.
So if you think about your investors, clearly they were buying into this concept ahead of the rest of the world. I mean, was there a lot of education that had to be done, and to sort of let them know that, hey, this is going to evolve as you go through? How did you achieve that?
We have found tremendous curiosity and enthusiasm from the investors, and most of them, I think, from the beginning of Rise One to now, have been on a journey themselves, and particularly in the past maybe 18, 24 months, that journey has ramped up for them in terms of the commitments they're making, the awareness, what their constituents are calling for. And so we get a lot of engagement and curiosity around it. And we do, and are always transparent that, just as John said at the beginning, this is an evolution. And it is not as if we pull out our tape measure and tell them exactly the centimeters of impact or the yards of impact, right? But what we do is provide a rigorous evidence way of estimating that impact for them. And we're transparent about it, which is key.
And are these investors the same? Are they sort of coming with you as you do these further rounds?
Yeah,
coming with us and growing, right, John?
Yeah, there's quite a bit of follow-on interest from the investor base, and if the response to our climate fund is any guide, the interest generally is growing, and I think there are a bunch of different forces out there that are happening right now. I mean, first of all, I think that there are many institutions that feel very committed to allocating more capital in this direction. I think there are institutions that feel under pressure
Mhm.
to allocate capital in this direction.
Mhm.
I will say that I think I mean, I've been in one form or another kind of watching flows of funds for, I hate to say it, I guess, this is my reunion year for my college degree at Chicago for 40 years. So I guess for 39 years, I've been watching these kinds of flows of funds move around since I've been kind of involved professionally. This is probably this might be the single biggest sort of systemic shift in investing curiosity and investing imperative that I've seen in that period of time. I mean, it's not really an exaggeration to say there's a bit of kind of tsunami of capital that's kind of flowing in this direction. And if you think about it, it's both, we're now seeing it in private markets. Before that, we've seen it manifested in public markets as well. We have ESG related ETFs, passive related products in the public equity markets. There's now active management product capability in the public equity markets. There's now ESG related debt financings that are also taking place. So the credit markets is now becoming a place where this is taking hold as well. I think that, and I think that maybe to borrow an analogy from one of your other guests from Ricketts, maybe this is maybe this is the third inning, something like that. It's still pretty early. It's still pretty early. So I think that we've seen an awful lot of real interest, commitment of capital, commitment of dollars, as well as curiosity that is kind of building where people want to learn more.
And so you both alluded to the fact that we've had this big shift in the last couple of years, let's say, in terms of interest. Sort of, what are things that you think could either sort of just kill that so that 5 years from now it's not there anymore? Or do you feel like, if things break, this is sort of the norm going forward?
Well, I think the returns have to be delivered. And I think we're well on the path to that, and others will have joined in that regard. But it is the fundamental premise on which so many of these institutional investors who have their own firefighters and teachers and such to return money to need to be able to be part of it. So I think that's sort of a key piece of it. There's absolutely a credibility issue to ensure confidence around impact to at least some real degree. And that's, again, what we spend every day thinking about. And then one of the things that I think is very much an accelerant is the entrepreneurs. So we have seen phenomenal social entrepreneurs come through, and several of them were interviewed by Judith Rodin for her recent book on this, and she said they're real entrepreneurs. I mean, these are fundamental business builders, and they are seeking mission-based capital. So that has been one of the really great surprises of the Rise Fund, is the magnet that it has been for entrepreneurs. And I think that's an accelerant for the next many years.
Yeah, I would just echo Marianne's comment on returns. I think that is absolutely critical. I think where this falls down or where it dramatically slows is really whether or not the ability, the collinearity, the ability to generate real competitive returns, I think is a critical issue. I think that so I think that's in my mind, that's the biggest factor. I think that a secondary factor that might sort of slow it down or create chop, if you will, in terms of people's kind of interest, is whether or not there are players or entrants into the space that are not that are kind of benefiting from this big flow of capital, but are not real in terms of their commitment to it. And so I think that accidents can happen along the way in terms of development of kind of an asset class, if you will. And I do think that impact / ESG style investing, climate investing is becoming an asset class of its own, despite the fact that there are sub asset classes within it. And I think that so accidents happening along the way can, of course, slow things down a little bit. I do think that Marianne's point about the we sort of call it, we're kind of calling it the flywheel effect of having stood up this strategy and putting it on the chassis of TPG, and therefore having the organization generally, and we have dedicated investment teams, but we have the organization generally sourcing opportunities for our impact fund. And the thing that I think, frankly, surprised all of us is we have entrepreneurs, CEO, business builders who have learned about the existence of a pool of capital like this. And what they've decided is, well, if I'm looking for a capital partner, why wouldn't I select a capital partner that is also mission-based or mission-focused, and frankly, not only is measuring for the benefit of their own decision-making, but also I can leverage off of the tools of measurement to how to, in terms of expressing my own sense of mission for my company. And so there's a kind of an enhanced tool there that a number of entrepreneurs, and Marianne can tell you directly because she's the one getting the requests, but the engagement from our portfolio company CEOs and founders in understanding that part of it and how they can articulate what impact they're creating with their businesses, both internally to their own employee base as well as to the market and customer base. Become a really interesting flywheel effect. So we've had entrepreneurs call us, which is, everybody talks about in private equity, the holy grail is proprietary sourcing, right? Everybody talks about it to some extent, right? But it's a super competitive world, as we know, right? But to have an entrepreneur call us and say, I'd like to explore whether or not we can do something together before they're in the process of calling, 3, 4, 5 other pools of capital, that's a huge differentiator for us in terms of our ability to drive success and drive returns.
So we have a couple of audience questions relating to tangentially to that point. John, question is, do you eventually see all of the criteria you've used for the Rise Fund becoming the norm for all TPG funds?
That's a good question. I don't think in the near term it's possible to become the norm, but as Marianne could tell you, because we had a discussion about this the other day, this question of how do we use the capabilities that we've developed in Y Analytics to help guide us in terms of what does the firm's overall portfolio look like, because I think that we have generally there is a sort of movement in the market to for professional investors, for institutional investors, to be thinking about what our own values are as a firm, as individuals, and therefore as investors, and how does that inform or affect what we invest in. So, as an example, one simple example, is we had an opportunity as a firm to invest a while back, let's say in Juul, and we decided as a firm we were not going to do that. We made a decision we weren't going to do that. That's just one example of kind of like, we decided that's not consistent with our values as an organization. We don't believe we should be supporting that, and so we didn't do it. Others did, and so that's their choice. But as we've gotten deeper into this question of sort of what are kind of our values as an organization, and therefore how do we want to think about the exposures that we have as a firm, what we're supporting, and how can we characterize how the mobilization of the dollars that we invest are actually creating various forms of impact. We have begun to think about how we use these tools within the rest of the complex. In addition to that, in particular in climate, where there's obviously a move to people expressing sort of a net zero pledge, or how is your investing activity affecting either the carbon load generally, That's another area where we've now, because we're raising this climate fund, that's another area where we feel we'll have a great set of tools to use within the context of sort of the overall investing activity of the firm. So we're frankly sort of coming to terms with that and working on that, just like I think a lot of other investors are. But I think we feel like we're pretty well equipped to be thinking about, because of what we've created, how do we use that over the course of the rest of our investing activity?
So we have a question about B Corp standards, and as the development of B Corp standards help guide companies into generating more impact. I guess the question is also, if you're already impact driven, what's the benefit of becoming a B Corp? So I don't know if either of you want to talk about that structure.
Well, I would say that there's B Corp is one, and then there are several other disclosures and standards and commitments that a corporation can make that that help to distinguish them from marketing to something that's more robust. And that's the key. It could be their commitment to science-based targets on the climate side. It could be their commitment to B Corp practices. It could be their commitment to disclose against the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board factors. There's so many different ways that they can express them. The fact that in some cases that then can be translated into governance and shareholder responsibilities is a really interesting expansion and field into what it means to be a public corporation. And so I think we, again, are at the early innings of that, to use that same analogy. But certainly the uptake on it and the challenge that it lays down to traditional notions around shareholders' role is quite important as we look at the evolution here.
So we have a question about climate, which is obviously a big issue. And the question is, it says the fundamental premise of economics is scarcity of resources. Given that, how would you consider the trade-off between how much additional poverty should society be willing to accept to eliminate global climate change? I mean, do you see that as a trade-off? I mean, we spoke about collinearity, for example, that returns don't really suffer if you make the right investments. I don't know if you all have a premise about climate change and is reducing its impact. Do you feel that that's fundamentally a zero-sum game or not?
I don't think we have an option for it to be a zero-sum game. We don't have as a society an ability to stare down the face of climate change and ignore it, or to stare down the face of the extraordinarily gross inequalities we have around the world and ignore that. And they are completely intertwined. Pandemic spreads, refugee crises. These are no longer border-contained issues. So that doesn't mean that there's a silver bullet, doesn't mean that there's an answer that makes any of that easy, but it does mean that we have to be addressing an environmental and climate policy that has some justice. I will say that there, while it can be a very unhopeful challenge, there are glimmers of hope. There are, as we've seen in the digital revolution, there are glimmers where you see technologies leapfrogging what's possible. And that's critical to the focus of what we have to do.
Okay. One of the questions is about, do you measure things like governmental risk? The questioner gives the example of, for example, if the US government were to give away intellectual property for, I presume, the vaccines, how do you think about those kinds of risks?
Well, I'm happy to start, but I think it actually probably comes more into the skill sets of the core deal teams in all of the ways that they think about their future, the future of the companies that they're looking from a financial standpoint. Many of the fields that we look at are regulatory considerations in them. And by the way, they should. So TPG is one of the largest healthcare investors in the private equity space. Clearly, anything that we do in climate has real questions around carbon pricing and markets related to that, other types of regulation and such. And so you really can go sector by sector. We have the first, in the RISE fund, the first digital bank that's been given a bank charter, right? So you have regulation in almost every one of these aspects. And that is a fundamental part of how we need to think about it, in addition to the fact that then we have governmental geopolitical risk if you're in emerging markets or otherwise. So it's not something actually that we bake directly into the impact assessment, but it's a consideration that is absolutely part of any good investment assessment and thesis. John, would you say anything else?
Those are just core issues in terms of, investment underwriting processes, emerging market risks, government intervention issues, rule of law, currency risk, go down the list. They're all part of the everyday underwriting activities that we go through, regardless of where in the firm we're investing.
Okay. So one of the questions that sort of I just wanted to throw out is, would you ever consider coming out with, say, the Y Analytics index that everybody else could, you know what I mean, as opposed to sort of whatever MSCI throws out tomorrow, something really data driven that other people could actually try to manage too?
So this is a good test between John and myself here. Look, we are constantly looking for ways to use data for good. So in the use of data for to direct financial capital in a way that will improvements, recognize impact, absolutely. I will say that a lot of our work benefits from having an inside out nature to it. So at the moment, a lot of what we do is we work in the private equity context, in a pretty rich way with companies and with company data. That's a radically different thing, and therefore a different degree of confidence than you can have if you're one of the 600 plus ratings agencies in ESG looking from the outside in. So we have a pretty high bar for what type of data we would want to rely on, but we very much are in exploration around that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So a couple of questions about from the audience. Will stakeholder focus continue to grow versus, say, the old, shareholder focus? And will they turn out to be a surprising benefit as it shifts focus away from short-termism in terms of business decision? Maybe just broadly, what do you think of the whole notion of the stakeholder versus shareholder, or is that like a straw man choice?
I think that I'm not sure there's as much of a binary kind of decision there. I think that because I think that shareholder concerns and shareholder value, creation of shareholder value, and a pretty rigorous perspective on that, I think in the world that we live in today, it's hard to ignore other stakeholder considerations. So I think this debate is, in some respects, I don't want to call it, I don't want to call it not real, but I do think that there is a lot more overlap, and there's been a lot more overlap with those considerations for a long time than this question of whether or not it's one or the other. I really don't think it is. I mean, when I think about how we think about the objectives of our investing activities, we really are trying to solve for great investment outcomes, and stakeholder considerations affect that in a real way. We've talked a lot about mission-based companies. That affects customer base. We already know that a lot of customers are influenced by product choices that they're making or service choices that they're making. And so I think a well led company needs to be conscious of that in terms of, how might the competitive dynamic of attracting the customer be impacted by those issues over time. I think you not paying attention to some of those stakeholder issues, I think you kind of do it at your own peril these days. And so I just don't see as big a difference. I think that I know you could find an example of sort of a real kind of a wider gap between, say, shareholder interest and stakeholder interest. But I would say that that's, in my experience, that's kind of the tails of the distribution, as opposed to sort of the fat part of the distribution, where I think that there's a lot of commonality there. So I honestly, I don't think we give it a lot of time and attention because I think we're actually in our practice every day. We're thinking about kind of stakeholder concerns.
Mhm.
Um, you know, and there, I could rip off a few different examples of that. So that's kind of, that's my reaction to it.
And in terms of short-termism and long-termism, it is a fascinating shift going on right now to start talking about net zero commitments a decade, 2 decades, 3
Mhm.
decades out.
Mhm.
Now we need to as a society, but you can hardly talk about next quarter. But every earnings call, companies are being asked about their long-term commitments here. So I think there is something going on underneath this around short-termism, long-termism. Whether and I think to John's point, it becomes a much less of a binary black and white shareholder
Mhm.
stakeholder.
Mhm.
It-
Okay, so I'm going to ask each of you a personal question now and then ask for your advice from both of you. First to Marianne, question that came in, what were the most valuable assets, learnings you took from your time at McKinsey coming into this role?
Sure. I'd say 3 things off the top of my head. One is people, people, people. The one in the first year that I was a young analyst at McKinsey, I got to tag along and do the interview notes for about 100 CEO interviews of Fortune 500 companies. And every one of them said they spent at least 50% of their time on people. So that was one. Second is always disaggregate the averages in the data. There's always more insight to be had below the average and the intuition of what you think is real. And then the third, I think, is more of a personal one, which is I just think people have a lot of life going on. Everyone you interact with has a lot of life going on. And so trying to walk into each interaction with a little bit of grace goes a long way.
Okay. John, this is for you. I'm not sure I understand the question, but I'm going to read it. Are you still competing with cutting horses, and what success have you had?
Great question.
Well, I'm not competing anymore, but I did for a while. It's sort of a quarter horse discipline where you ride into a herd of cattle and you have to separate one out and keep it separated for a while and then do it again in 2.5 minutes and you're judged. And it was a little bit of a distraction kind of passion for me and my family for a while. And so we're not doing it anymore, but it's one of the things that I think we all probably have had experiences with is that when we get involved in things, one of the great kind of lessons that we kind of learn is that when you do things that kind of takes you out of your comfort zone, you not only learn a lot of new things, but it also takes you places and it causes you to meet people that you otherwise wouldn't interact with. And for a kid who grew up in suburban New Jersey, and went to school in Chicago, then went back to work in New York. I don't think that people would have predicted that I would have ended up competing on the back of a horse in, Abilene, Texas, and Franklin, Tennessee, and Augusta, Georgia, and places like that. And so it takes you places and you see things and you meet people that probably give you a different perspective than you otherwise would have on kind of, the toing and froing of kind of this country of ours and, how people think about different things. And so I'm not doing it anymore, but it was a valuable thing to do.
That's great. Okay, so the last advice from both of you, the question is, how do we as young people, and we have a lot of students graduating in a couple of weeks, undergrad and from Booth, how do we start building the skills that we need to start asking the right questions and be have the most value add in the dynamic space of impact investing? In other words, what does the industry need from the junior people who will be the leaders of tomorrow? So what advice would you give
So
them?
I'll say briefly, your curiosity.
Hmm.
Be curious. Be curious about the new work environment that you find yourself in your first job. Be curious about why the decision was being made. Be curious about why it seems the answer is, and dig in. Your curiosity will go a long way to helping you build those skills.
Yeah, I would say that first of all, impact investing is becoming more mainstream, but it's not mainstream yet. And so from an opportunity perspective, don't always sort of go mainstream. Think about kind of the next horizon. And this is a really interesting next horizon in my view, in terms of, where the, kind of where things are flowing to. So I would say that, be very open-minded when you're, thinking about what your options are. And then the only way to really learn in this business, in my opinion, is, you got to get involved. And, somebody once told me, somebody once gave me very good advice, which is don't be a passenger, be a participant. And so get involved, roll your sleeves up, and if to the extent that, you can, not be afraid of kind of delving into a place where you might not be as comfortable, don't fear it, because that's where sort of your learning curve gets the steepest, when you're feeling a little bit out of your comfort zone or a little bit uncomfortable. So, I'd encourage people to kind of, dive into it and embrace it.
Thank you both, John and Marian. This has been fascinating. I really appreciate your willingness to come and be very open and direct and answer the questions. And also congratulations. I think that you've clearly been way ahead of your time in picking an area and in real Chicago fashion, sort of looking at the data and using that to drive the things that you're doing for impact, both financially and otherwise. So thank you both for taking the time to be here.
Thank you so much for having us.
Pleasure. Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
See you, John. See you, Marian.
See you.